Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined again by author and professor Noah Charney. Noah is a professor of art history with a specialization in art crime and is a prolific author of many books, including The Slavic Myths, which I was able to chat to Noah and co-author Svetlana about in 2023. Today, though, we are chatting all about his new book, The Thefts of the Mona Lisa, the complete story of the world's most famous artwork, published by Rowman and Littlefield. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the channel. It's great to have you back.
Thanks so much for having me. It was so much fun last time. I was delighted to be invited again for this new book.
My pleasure. And this book is very different to the Slavic Myths book. So do you want to start off by telling everyone what the book is all about?
So the thing that I'm known for, I'm the art crime guy, which sounds suspicious, but what it actually means is I'm really the first professor who studied art crime from a criminological angle. When I first started out, when I was a postgraduate student, art crime really wasn't a field of study. There were a few books on it, but mostly by journalists, and they were usually about individual famous cases. There wasn't a superstructure through which to analyze it. And I got lucky because very early in my career, before I'd even finished my PhD, I had this New York Times Magazine article come out about my work in this field as groundbreaking. And that really helped launch my career. And so while I have written a book about Slavic mythology, that's a relatively new field. And this one is really more in my wheelhouse. The book is called The Thefts of the Mona Lisa, the complete story of the world's most famous artwork. And it tells everything you need to know about the Mona Lisa, about its creation, about Leonardo, about the mysteries surrounding it, conspiracy theories, but also its famous theft in 1911, a linked series of thefts from the Louvre in which Picasso was involved, the fate of the Mona Lisa during the Second World War, which is a bit of a puzzle, and also about multiple copies of Mona Lisa and which ones might be also by Leonardo, if any. So it's basically everything you need about Mona Lisa in one package.
Amazing. So from the Renaissance all the way up to World War II. So really, it's a huge scope. Did you decide to write the book because this is just your niche, or was there sort of a gap for this book waiting? Is there any other sort of book on the Mona Lisa that you've sort of, added to, or is this brand new?
So this is probably the single most famous property theft in peacetime history. So there have been many books on it. It's also referenced in lots of things, pop culture and movies and documentaries. And there's some good ones. This book is a different approach. One is there's sort of a demand for it because it hasn't been approached from a more analytical perspective. Most people are telling a really good story, and they focus on the 1911 theft, but they don't necessarily go into all the aspects of it. So there's some very good books that I used as points of departure. And the main, novelties of my own study is piecing together play by play what happened with the theft itself and its aftermath, uh, focusing on Picasso's involvement in stealing from the Louvre, which gets very small press, surprisingly, because it's such a good story with such a famous person involved, and then trying to unpack the often confusing white noise behind Mona Lisa, because to be honest, it's a wonderful Renaissance portrait, but it isn't more than that, and it doesn't need to be. And yet its fame makes people want to sort of superimpose more attributes to it or backstories than it has, which it really doesn't need because it's got such an amazing story as unto itself. But basically, all these conspiracy theories that you hear about a couple times a year, somebody finds hieroglyphics in her eyes or a hidden picture of an alligator. These things are they're basically there only if you really look hard for them and superimpose them with your imagination. And it doesn't need that.
So if you squint and sort of put your head at a certain angle, you might see it, but also you might not.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's not familiar, do you want to just tell us a bit about this famous theft in 1911 of the Mona Lisa?
Sure. So the Mona Lisa theft in 1911 in August is the one that gets all the headlines, and it quite literally got headlines because it was so universally written about in the newspaper media at the time. And the theft took place on a Monday morning when the museum was closed. And if we imagine that the perpetrator, whose name was Vincenzo Peruggia, he was an Italian expat, amateur artist, and mandolin enthusiast with a very nice mustache. He looks like a hipster from today, sure. And he was living in Paris trying to make a go of it as an original artist, but he had trouble doing so. And so he was making ends meet working as a handyman for a company that was subcontracted by the Louvre to make protective boxes, glass boxes to cover famous works, because they were afraid that political activists would attack works of art as one had a few years earlier. So he found himself with what's really a crime of opportunity. He had a Louvre worker's uniform, he was regularly there, and he had the mistaken impression that the Mona Lisa had been looted from Italy by Napoleon. Now, this was a pretty good guess because Napoleon had looted thousands of cultural heritage objects from Italy during his Italian campaign. But Mona Lisa happened to not be one of them. At the end of Leonardo da Vinci's life, he was invited by the French king, Francis I, to enter his patronage. And Francis set him up in his own castle. He brought his assistants with him. He set up his studio, and at the end of his life, he was working effectively for the French king. And when he died, his estate went on to his assistant, and the French king bought many works that are in the Louvre now from the assistant, and Mona Lisa was one of them. But Peruggia didn't know that. So Peruggia decided he was going to steal the Mona Lisa to repatriate it to Italy. And so he hid himself in a service closet in the Louvre overnight. And the next morning, he waited for the footfalls of the guards to disappear down the corridor. And he snuck out and he went straight across to the Salon Carré, which is where the Mona Lisa was hanging. And he gingerly lifted it from the wall. And it was in a heavy, ornate gold frame, so it was hard to maneuver. But he carried it to a service stairwell. There he removed the panel from the frame, set the frame aside, wrapped the panel in a white sheet, and headed down a spiral staircase, which was meant to lead to the court of the Sphinx and then out into early morning Paris. But when he reached the door at the bottom, he reaches out his hand for the doorknob and he grasps it and he twists it, but it's locked. So he's locked inside with the Mona Lisa under his arm. And he's trying to figure out what to do. He thought this might be a possibility, so he brought a toolbox with him. And there's a suggestion that he tried to remove the door from the hinges, like unscrew the hinges, but realized this would be too noisy. He did unscrew the doorknob, thinking that might make the lock release, but it didn't. So he put the doorknob in his pocket. It's still locked. And then he hears footsteps coming down the stairs. And he must have been terrified, but it turned out to be a janitor, like a night janitor, who apparently was not that surprised to see someone in the Louvre worker's uniform carrying a Mona Lisa-shaped object wrapped in a white sheet. We don't know what his reaction was, but he also opened the door. He saw that there was no doorknob, apparently was nonplussed by this. He unlocked the door and let Peruggia out. And there was a witness who saw a guy in a Louvre worker's uniform walking past his shop when he was setting up in the morning, and he thought it was odd that he threw something over his shoulder as he disappeared into early morning Paris. And when police investigated, it was the doorknob that they found. So that's how this famous theft began.
Wow, that's like a fiction novel, reading this sort of amateur try to be, burglaring museums and stuff. So the fact that that's real life is pretty cool. So was the Mona Lisa already sort of a household name at the time when this theft happened, or was it because of the theft that it became so well known?
This is a great question because it was very famous, but it's really the theft that made it the most famous artwork in the world. So why was it famous? It has to do with a cult of interest in Leonardo, particularly among Anglophone audiences. In England is where it began in earnest. So Leonardo was one of the leading artists of the High Renaissance, particularly those based in Florence. But he wasn't interested in painting particularly. He only made a handful of paintings. He was really interested in the human body, exploring science, engineering. He made most of the money in his career as a military engineer and as a musician. He was one of the greatest musicians in Europe at the time. He played an instrument called the lira di braccio, which looks kind of like a sitar, if you're familiar with the Indian instrument, kind of like a combo between a viola and a guitar. And that was his thing. And so the painting was like, yeah, I can paint too. No big deal. Um, so he was interesting as a character thanks to Giorgio Vasari's writing about him in Vasari's very famous book called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which came out in 1550 and again in 1562. Now, for some future episode, I got a whole book about that book too. So that's considered the first work of art history. And Giorgio Vasari was an artist to the Medici court in Florence and an architect. And if you've ever been to the Uffizi Museum in Florence, he was the architect who designed it. Uffizi means offices. It was originally the offices of the Duchy of Tuscany. And so he was best known for this group biography of artists. And he really elevated the status of artists by writing about them as quirky three-dimensional people. And one of his stars, his stars were basically Leonardo and Michelangelo. Those are the two he's situated as the zenith of what an artist can do. And his book was hugely popular. It was a bestseller in Italian, of course, but also there was an edition in England. And he focused on Mona Lisa and talked about the enigmatic smile that people seem so drawn to. And then British scholars who had a love affair with Italy in the 19th century, particularly with Florence, picked up on this. And Mona Lisa, because of the fascination with Leonardo, not Mona Lisa specifically, but with the artist, got all excited about it. And so it was certainly among the most famous high Renaissance portraits, but no more so than, let's say, Raphael's portrait of a lady with a unicorn, or Leonardo's La Belle Ferronnière, or Lady with an Ermine, until it got stolen. And then it made international headlines in France, of course, in Paris. And this was a period that was a golden age for print journalism. You'd get magazines, periodicals. Some would come out more than once a day. And there was constant news about this. But it was also international. And you get all over the world, people were writing updates. And the Mona Lisa was missing for more than 2 years. And so over that period, the hunt for it captured people's imaginations. And it really wasn't until the Titanic sank that the public imagination shifted to some other headline, and interest in the Mona Lisa receded until it was found again. And then it shot back up. And so it's really thanks to that it's the most famous work in the world.
Wow, that's what a tale, honestly. And so you mentioned just before that not only did Leonardo not paint very much, but there's quite a few different versions of the Mona Lisa. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this can get very confusing for people because the headlines, if you just sort of glance at the headlines, it sounds like there's multiple versions that he painted that we know of, and he may have painted more than one. In fact, there are works of his for which he painted multiples, and they're both by Leonardo. There's the Virgin of the Rocks. There's a version at the National Gallery and at the Louvre. And there are two versions of Madonna of the Yarn Winder, for example. And why would he paint multiples? Well, people liked his work, and sometimes more than one person wanted the same subject matter. But we have no evidence that he painted multiples of the Mona Lisa. In fact, Mona Lisa was not a very important painting to him. It's a portrait of the wife of a wealthy merchant from the area around Florence. The merchant's name was Francesco del Giocondo. And in Italian, the painting is not called Mona Lisa, it's called La Gioconda, which means the Giocondo lady. And in French, it's La Joconde, which is the same thing. And Mona Lisa basically means my lady Lisa. And her name was Lisa Gherardini. And he was commissioned, Leonardo, when he was very young and inexperienced. And Francesco del Giocondo was friendly with his father, who was a notary. And it seems like the commission was like, can you do my son a favor and commission him to paint a portrait of your wife because he's pretty good? And he never finished it. Leonardo felt like he never finished it. And there's no evidence that Francesco del Giocondo ever paid for it or had possession of it. So it was probably something, Leonardo today, he would probably be given Ritalin and thought to have ADD. He was so excited by things, passionate about them, but jumping from one thing to the next. And he himself claimed he never finished a single artwork. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but that's what he felt like. He was just jumping from one project to the next. He had limited attention span, not from moment to moment, but in terms of over the course of weeks. So he'll do a project for a few weeks and then something else comes up and he'll jump to that. So he felt like a lot of things were unfinished. And this was one of them. So he kept the painting because he liked it particularly. And he kept it until his death with him. And there are multiples that look remarkably like the original. Part of this has to do with the fact that Francis I, the King of France, really loved it. He kept it in his toilet, which doesn't actually mean people hear that and they think he kept it next to the toilet in his bathroom. I mean, I like that image. That means like his toilet was like his suite of bathing rooms at the palace. So it probably was not literally opposite the latrine, but somewhere in there because he liked it so much. And it was very popular as a subject for other artists to copy when they were at the French castle of Fontainebleau as guests. So this was part of the appeal, that it was beloved of the French king. And then if we look at contemporary copies to when Leonardo was alive, this is where it gets interesting because we have some copies like the Prado Mona Lisa, which contains the same underdrawings as the original. So most painters will make underdrawings that they sketch out before they start painting. And even when they start painting, they will make changes to the positioning of figures in subtle ways as they're developing the concept. And it's very unusual for someone to say, this is my idea, and I'm going to paint it over the next, 3 weeks, and it's going to be exactly my idea without any change. That didn't happen very often. And Leonardo would play around and make changes. Now, as he makes changes, he paints over his previous idea. And those changes are called pentimenti in Italian, which it basically means like repentance. It's like, I wish I hadn't done that. And the term describes changes that the artist decided to cover over because they said, I don't like it like that. I want it a different way. And these can be seen by examining paintings in different light spectra, like infrared, ultraviolet, and X-rays. You can see beneath the surface without damaging anything. And what's cool about the Prado Mona Lisa is it has all the same changes, so the same developmental conceptual changes that were painted in as the original. Now, that's a clue that tells us that Leonardo wasn't painting it himself, because it doesn't make sense that you paint two paintings from scratch and make all the mistakes and then change them. If you paint a copy, you do a complete work, somebody likes it enough to commission another copy, and then you exactly copy the work you began with. But it does tell us that it was painted alongside the original because the changes are invisible without looking in these light spectra. So it tells us that an assistant of his was painting a copy alongside the original, probably as a learning exercise. There's also a suggestion, thanks to the technology available today, that Mona Lisa did not originally look the way she looks today. Now, we know there are some things she had that you can't see anymore that simply have faded. She used to have eyebrows. She used to have a veil over her face, a thin, translucent veil. But the reconstructions of what the Mona Lisa may have originally looked like, and it looks very different. And one thought is that there are actually three layers of a portrait of a woman on the painting. The one we see, and then two mid layers. And the first one is actually what Lisa Gherardini looked like. And she looks very different from the original Mona Lisa, but like some of the copies. And so the commission may have been, this is the portrait of my wife, and then Leonardo kept it for decades and touched it up as he went, and he shifted it so the face looks quite different than the original did. So it's a big story with lots of things to unpack, but it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, because I guess eventually, if the person who's commissioned it never picks it up, you go, well, why do I want a painting of someone else's wife when I can make changes to it and make it someone new, someone different,
Yeah.
So fascinating. And I like that, we're using these modern technologies to try and sort of find out what's happening underneath and all the layers. It's just incredible. So obviously you have worked with art crime and art history for a long time. Is there anything that you discovered whilst you were working on this book that surprised you or particularly interested you or you hadn't noticed before?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the thing that actually I think is most interesting for people, because most people, will have heard about the Mona Lisa theft in 1911, but most people won't have heard of a linked series of thefts that involved Pablo Picasso, the famous painter, that was a reason that Picasso was arrested by Paris police and brought in for questioning about the Mona Lisa theft. So what surprises me is this is such a big name artist, and it's uh, an available fact if you look in the right sources, original sources. And Picasso himself admitted to it in an interview in Life magazine towards the end of his life. And yet it's very rarely written about. It's called the Affaire des Statuettes, or the Statuette Affair. And it involves Picasso and his best friend Guillaume Apollinaire, who was a Polish poet writing in French and living in Paris. And so Apollinaire had a secretary working for him, a Belgian guy who sounds like a fascinating character named Honoré Joseph Géry Pierret. And he was a kleptomaniac and sort of a con man and a very unusual character. And he was stealing regularly from the Louvre Museum. This was at a time alarms had been invented, but they were irregularly used because they would go off incorrectly often. It was not a golden age of alarms. The Louvre had a display system where you might just have a table or a plinth with a statue on it that's not fixed into place and not underneath a glass vitrine. So, I mean, in theory, you could just pick it up and leave. And Géry Pierret had been stealing regularly from it. He was stealing so often that he once asked his girlfriend, "Honey, I'm going to the Louvre. Do you want anything?" And she thought he meant there's a shopping arcade next to the Louvre where you can actually buy things, and he meant the museum itself. So if we go back in time a little bit, at a special exhibition at the Louvre of ancient Iberian statuary that Picasso had seen when he first moved to Paris before he had made a name for himself. And he was fascinated in particular by three statue heads. And he wrote about them. His girlfriend at the time remembers him remarking how fascinated he was with them. And they look quite abstract. In fact, they look like Picasso paintings. They're ancient Iberian statue heads that have, abstracted features of the faces. They don't look realistic, and this is what he liked about them. Also, being Spanish, he felt like this is my proto art. This is part of my genetics. And what happened was, Géry Pierret was involved in stealing exactly the statue heads that Picasso had admired, and he sold them to Picasso. And Picasso's girlfriend at that time, this was in 1906, Fernande Olivier, wrote in her diary, which has been published, it was odd that all of Picasso's art collection was on display except for these statue heads, which he kept in a drawer hidden away. And she thought this was very strange. So fast forward a little bit to 1911. The Mona Lisa is stolen, and the police are completely baffled. It's the director of the Louvre retired in disgrace. There was, at the time, very famous commissioner of police named Louis Lepine, who was an early proponent of forensic investigative techniques, and at this time was a real protagonist of criminal investigation. But this is the thing that he could never solve. And they actually interviewed all Louvre staff, including Peruggia, twice, but never suspected him. And there are all these theories, but years went by, and they got desperate. And then what was happening in parallel was the media got involved. So the French, particularly liberal media, took this as an opportunity to make fun of the conservative government, being like, haha, you can't even keep your own cultural treasures protected. And they would write about this constantly. And one of the Paris magazines, Paris Journal, for which Apollinaire wrote art criticism, announced that they would have a reward for information leading to the recovery of the Mona Lisa. So they basically did a parallel investigation. And people were writing in with tips, and most of them didn't go anywhere. But then Géry Pierret wrote in. And he had argued with Apollinaire and left and was living abroad. And he wrote a letter that basically, we have the letter, that basically says, this is not how you play cricket. I was stealing from the Louvre very nicely, and now somebody goes and ruins my party. I'm not going to be able to steal as much as I used to. And I was thinking maybe I would steal the Mona Lisa too. And this is just, I'm really annoyed with this situation. That was the gist of it. And police knew of his association with Apollinaire and therefore Picasso, because Apollinaire and Picasso were, at the time, minor celebrities. They hadn't quite catapulted to the celebrity status they would enjoy later, but they were people about town who people would recognize. And so the police arrest both of them and bring them in for questioning. And Picasso was so scared, he claimed to have never seen Apollinaire before in his life. And this was his best friend who he's in photos with. Why were they scared? They were innocent of the Mona Lisa theft, and they were quickly released because they had alibis, but they were guilty of this other theft. So what I unpack is how this happened, and this is based on the work of other scholars, but most of the work that I do, honestly, is like translating the work of scholars into something that's accessible for the widest possible audience. So I do a step-by-step, a play-by-play of what happened, and what I have noted was that the statue heads in question were not on public display at the time that they were stolen. They were in storage. Géry Pirret said he was just cruising through the Louvre and saw some nice statue heads, and he put them under his trench coat, and he had the balls to ask a security guard for where the nearest exit was. And then he left, and he thought Picasso might like them, and Picasso hadn't seen them before but bought them anyway. That's his story. And it was totally bogus because they weren't on display. He had to go in storage and seek them out. They're exactly the ones Picasso had admired years before. And they're unwieldy. They're, like head-sized and made of stone, and there's 3 of them, and one person couldn't fit them under his trench coat, so he must have had assistants, and they surely would have been Picasso and or Apollinaire. We know that they were terrified of this because as soon as they got back from being interrogated about the Mona Lisa theft, they had an emergency meeting at Picasso's house. They put the statue heads in a suitcase, and they're going to take it to the Seine River and throw it in to hide the evidence. But in the morning, they came back with a suitcase. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. They loved the art too much. And then Apollinaire in disguise, and I imagine him wearing like a Groucho Marx mustache and glasses, and that's it, shows up at the offices of the very magazine for which he's the art critic and brings the statue heads and drops them off. And that way they're returned to the Louvre, and they're at the Louvre today. And the images in the book are from the Louvre archive because the statue heads are back now. But in this way they were returned. And the kicker that's kind of fun, the punchline, is that these statue heads appear in Picasso's first masterpiece, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, from 1907, which is considered the first artwork of the modernist movement. And the faces of the prostitutes painted in it are based on the faces of the statue heads. So we have the invention of artistic modernism, this theft to thank for it.
That's incredible. So much drama and intrigue, and it's really just him stealing some heads for his buddy, and so great. I think the final question to round out the interview is, what is something that you think that everybody should know about either the topic in general or your book specifically?
What a great question. I usually do lots of interviews about the same things, and you ask questions that I don't get asked before, so this is always a treat. Okay. I think it's interesting to know why something is the most famous in the world, the most famous example. And there's all these aspects of this story, but the more collective one is how the Mona Lisa or anything became an icon. And so many people around the world, just about everyone would see a picture of Mona Lisa and know its name and who made it. They might also know that it's in the Louvre in Paris, but that's probably the end of the story. And it's something that I think people feel like they know, but if they actually were to be thoughtful about it, what they know about it is very superficial. It's only those few basic facts. And there's a lot more there. But tracing how something becomes an icon is maybe the most interesting aspect that I hadn't thought about while I was writing the book. I was piecing together how the Mona Lisa was made and what happened to it as a physical object, and also people's reactions to it. But thinking about it, I think of it as maybe an invisible icon. Invisible in a sense that everybody knows it, but nobody knows anything about it beyond like 3 words. And so tracing that back and also trying to take something that the hook is that you think you know this, but there's so much more to it, and it's a really good story. I think that's the goal of the book.
Oh, That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Noah, for joining me today and talking about your book. It's been another pleasure.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I love being on your show. So next book, I'll be in touch again.
So good. And if anyone is looking to purchase it, I will leave the link down below to do that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my sweater, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon with another video.